Well, hello and welcome this afternoon to this special Hypothetical Yazi Comes to Townsville. I'm Paul Barclay from Big Ideas at ABC RN and online at abc.net.au/RN. It's a really exciting time to be here for this Bigger Than Ben-Hur event. As you may have heard earlier, this is not really a hypothetical situation at all that we're examining today. History teaches us that one day Townsville will be hit by a major cyclone again, and if that happens at high tide, the storm surge could potentially be deadly. This is a scenario planning event which will bring together a range of different perspectives in what we think is a pretty groundbreaking conversation, and a conversation that we hope could save lives in the future and offer a pathway towards a stronger, more resilient recovery after Yazi actually hits Townsville. So if you can bear that context in mind as we kick off today's hypothetical. It is 9 in the morning on Monday the 5th of February 2018. A Category 4 system named Claudia has formed in the Coral Sea about 1,000 kilometres to the northeast of Townsville. The Bureau of Meteorology issues a cyclone information bulletin. Cyclone Claudia is tracking in Townsville's general direction and is expected to make landfall early Thursday morning. It's expected to strengthen as it approaches. A king tide is due at 3 a.m. on Thursday, which may well coincide with Claudia's landfall. Rod Webb, you are the guy in charge of the Bureau. You've issued the Cyclone Bulletin. What could the double whammy of a king tide and a Category 4 cyclone mean for Townsville and its residents?
Well, clearly very significant inundation. You're normally thinking about 1 metre for every category in terms of storm tide as a general rule, so you're talking about metres of water over low-lying areas, water that wouldn't normally see it, even in the heaviest flooding.
So people in that immediate evacuation zone, they're going to get flooded?
Potentially flooded and with 200 to 300 kilometre an hour wind gusts at the same time, so quite hazardous conditions.
It's 2018. How accurate is your new forecasting and warning system technology? Why should we believe you?
Well, at this stage we're standing up most of North Queensland, anywhere between probably, if we're saying 3 days out, anywhere between about Cairns and Bowen or Mackay would be saying prepare for a cyclone coming. That's as accurate as we can be at 3 days.
Percentage figure about accuracy? It's going to happen?
It's going to happen somewhere on the coast, that's what we're saying, and now it's plain makes good sense to start getting prepared.
In spite of the news from Rob and the Bureau, the weather in Townsville is sunny. We're expecting a top of 31 degrees Celsius. Qantas and Jetstar and Virgin have put on extra flights to meet the expected demand for people wanting to get in and out of town mostly out of town I should say, before Claudia arrives. Councillor Jenny Hill, you're the Mayor of Townsville. You've lived through cyclones before and warnings before. At this stage, it's a predicted Category 4 cyclone coupled with a king tide. Are you calm?
No.
Are you worried?
I'd be worried. I'd be speaking to Alan Morris, our Coordinator for Disaster Management at Council, and we'd be calling a meeting, a local disaster management group meeting, to ascertain the information from the Bureau and to put forward some steps in terms of beginning the process of educating the community.
Are you assuming the worst? Are you taking Rob's information and basically thinking, yeah, that's going to be spot on?
No, you'd be thinking, well, knowing what cyclones can traditionally do, they can go anywhere up and down the coast, but a Cat 4 of a big size, doesn't matter if the eye was to go through Cardwell, we'd see some effect from it.
Glenn Catchell from the Townsville Police, you've been appointed the Disaster Coordinator. You have 3 days to try and secure the place. There's already early talk of a mass evacuation of the waterfront, even perhaps some nearby islands. You need to cyclone-proof the area as much as possible, get your refuges together, accommodate quite possibly thousands of people in safe refuges around town. You've got to organise the security, secure up the communications. Where do you start, first of all, with this?
Paul, it's very much a regimented process. We have a detailed process in place where we draw upon all agencies. We'd be calling a district disaster management group meeting and highlighting, and part of that is the mayor, and with all those agencies establish our state of readiness and make sure all preparations in place to deal with the impending threat. As far as the evacuation zones come, there's still variability in which way that cyclone may track, but there's a very detailed surge areas detailed across the city in the red, the orange, the yellow and the blue, and in that area there's approximately 62,000 people that may be affected. That's the type of area and impact it may have. But obviously the red area, there's approximately 9,000 people in there, and they're the people at highest risk. So it's very much a situation whereby we make sure our preparations are there and put the planning processes actively in place.
62,000 people. Worst case scenario, you're looking at evacuating a hell of a lot of those people. Is that even possible?
But, well, it's not specifically possible as such, because what happens is the resilience planning around the city is that residents should move to friends and relatives in high places, areas out of the storm surge zone. We have capacity for a certain number of residents if they don't have accommodation. The tourists, those vulnerable people, say be tourists, the aged, the people with health conditions, itinerants in the community. So we have a capacity of providing some refuge, but we haven't got the capacity to move 62,000. Part of the resilience is that people go to friends and relatives in high places out of the storm surge zone, and that's part of the resilience building and getting ready for Queensland that's implemented.
Okay, Townsville's local disaster management group has now told residents in the storm tide evacuation zones that we've just been referring to that they need to get their action plans ready. Well, residents in those evacuation zones wake up on Tuesday morning to some very bad news indeed.
Hello everyone. The weather focus remains firmly fixed in the tropics. Severe tropical cyclone Claudia continues tracking towards the coast. Now the system's now intensified to a Category 5. There are destructive winds of 285 kilometres per hour near the centre. Currently, it's located about 340 kilometres northeast of Townsville and moving southwest at 19 kilometres per hour. So at this stage, it looks like it will cross tomorrow morning in the early hours, and if it remains on its current track, Palm Island is right in the firing line. However, the warning area extends from Cape Tribulation right down to Proserpine, that's the Brown area, and inland to Pentland, with destructive winds of up to 220 kilometres per hour expected to develop between Bowen and Innisfail overnight. Claudia will bring torrential rain, and on top of the heavy falls we've already seen up there, authorities expect the highways will be cut and Townsville will be isolated by tomorrow morning. Now there's also the risk of a huge storm surge, and if the system crosses as predicted around the high tide at 3 a.m. tomorrow morning. Now the potential of this dangerous storm tide has already prompted an evacuation of 40,000 residents. That's the largest in the state's history.
Okay, David Crisafulli, you're the Premier of Queensland. I should point out Campbell Newman now leads a global engineering firm. You've had a rapid acceleration through the ranks. A week is a long time in politics, as you know. Townsville's now facing essentially a Cyclone Yasi scale impact on top of a king tide, the biggest storm surge event to hit an Australian city in modern times. You've been continually briefed and updated about the Claudia developments. It falls to you to announce Queensland's largest ever evacuation, 40,000 people in the storm tide zone. What do you say to northern Queenslanders to ensure there's not wholesale panic?
Well, first and foremost, they'll be blessed because in the course of the last half a decade, they will know that we have built on events like this one that we're doing today. They will know that we have built on a disaster mitigation strategy which involves proper planning in place, The things that Glenn mentioned before, making sure those agencies come together. We look them in the eye and we treat them like grown-ups, and we tell them this is the information, this is the best case scenario, this is the worst case scenario. If somebody tells you to evacuate, you must evacuate. If you're in those outside areas, we'll treat you like grown-ups and you'll make your own mind up with the information that comes to hand. We are increasingly becoming a more and more disaster resilient community, and by 2018 I've every faith that we will be the most disaster resilient state in the nation.
You need to really give them two messages. One, that as the Premier, you'll look after them, but secondly, they have to look after themselves as well. How do you sell that dual message to them at a time when they may well have been keeping track of your resilience work over the previous half a decade, but they've just seen the weather bulletin from Jenny and they're feeling pretty bloody panicked right now?
And that's understandable, but that's the balance between self-empowerment and leadership. And we have increasingly said to people, you must play a role. It can't always be the authorities that has to be there to pick up the pieces. But there is a role for the authorities, and that role is to provide clear direction and to not spoon-feed people in a manner that you only give them the little bits of information you think they're worthy of getting. You've got to give people the information for them to make informed decisions. Part of that, though, also involves authorities picking up the pieces for those who aren't capable of making those decisions. So that might be the disabled, the infirmed or the elderly.
Glenn Catchell, back to you from the Townsville Police. Enforcing this massive evacuation is your job for all practical purposes. How do you get the word out to those most at risk in the evacuation zone? People beyond the red zone will not be familiar with evacuation. They've probably never even thought that it's a possibility. Time is of the essence. You can't door knock 30,000 people. How do you get the word out?
The warnings would have been coming out particularly early. The messages comes out very early. We drive it with resources through social media, through all the various communications, television, radio. The message has got to get out very early of what the impending threat is and how we manage that. The key areas, and we've done it here previously during other events, is those key areas that are highest impact. We have the manpower. We draw on assistance, the ADF and other support agents, the SES, and those areas, the key areas of greatest threat are most certainly those we'd have to. You simply are obligated to make sure those people are fully informed. We make all avenues of the media, but also, if necessary, foot on the ground to make sure that the boxes are checked.
But North Queenslanders are a stubborn lot. They don't like to be told what to do, a race of individuals who've lived in this rugged part of the state for a while. The Premier said to them, if you get told to move, you ought to move. But Lois has been living down by the water. She's 83. She's heard these cyclone warnings before. She's lived through it all before, and she's not going anywhere. She's staying put. How do you get Lois to move?
Paul, we've met plenty of people like Lois. We have my officers reason with them. I have NCOs, supervisors that'll come back and talk to them and insist the message is relayed. It's putting a plausible argument, being logical, being reasonable. Most people are reasonable, and they explain the extent of the impact, the potential impact. There will be rare individuals that are difficult, but the general public in Queensland are well informed. They see the effect of cyclones, particularly at this end of the state. They're aware of the impacts and how it can affect them.
Mayor, you're working very closely now with the police. Both you and the Premier are working closely with the police. What's the most important thing that you need from them right now?
In terms of resilience and getting people out, we'd be sending text messages saying to people, if you're in this area, you could drown, get out. It's as simple as that. And you'd say to people, don't ring us in the middle of the event because we're not coming to get you. You're making a decision about whether you live or die, and that's the hardline attitude you'd have in the media. The real problem for us, though, will be to convince people, because there have been events in the past where at times it would seem we've cried wolf, and it's just trying to get over that resistance in the community.
Wayne Preedy from Fire and Emergency Services, there's just so much to do right now. Sorting out the cyclone refuges, for example, you need people to staff them. You also require plenty of volunteers for all those other public protection jobs. Where's all the staff and volunteers going to come from? Because they've got their own homes and families to protect as well. And if you do find them, where do you house them so that they're not at risk?
Look, we're very fortunate here that we've got local disaster management groups and the agencies involved with those groups that do this stuff every year, Paul. We're well-practiced, well-rehearsed plans. We've got a large region now extending all the way up to Cairns. So if need be, our staff could be at home, protecting, defending their own families, and we'll bring resources in a timely manner from, for instance, to the north of us, or even well south down to Brisbane, as we've practiced before.
And so you're confident that you can do this in the short time available?
We did it just recently with Tropical Cyclone Ida, and brought people in from the southeast corner of the state to man the cyclone shelters, so people up there could be at home with their families.
Alan from the ABC, this is a disaster unfolding, an emergency. The ABC, as we know, has a statutory responsibility to assist during an emergency. What are you doing right now to fulfil that responsibility?
Well, we've had someone on the Disaster District Management Group who's across all the information as best we can be. So we are, of course, reporting it. It's right across our radio. So at a local level, we're reporting it. We're doing two other things, though. We are sitting in Sydney panicking and trying to work out how to get extra resources into the area as quickly as we can. Are there flights still going in? Where can we send people? Where can we go? Because the other issue that's confronting us is we're part of the community. If it's a Category 5 cyclone, our building's going to be evacuated. Our building's going to close down. We're going to take down our link. So we've got a major logistical exercise on our hands ourselves, not just to keep communicating the story, but to put in place plans that will allow us to keep broadcasting right through the event.
And it's an emergency, so that role comes to the fore, but it's also a big story. So you want to get the story out too. This could be one of the biggest natural disasters to hit Australia since 50 years earlier when Cyclone Tracy blew through.
That's right. We do have an emergency broadcasting role, and there are certain responsibilities we take on. We have an agreement with the Queensland Government, as we do with many other governments, on the extra things we will do when it comes to broadcasting the standard. We're still using the standard emergency signal in 2018, so we'll keep using that as part of our coverage and making clear announcements that are well sourced. But we're also talking to the community, engaging with the community, talking to a number of disparate sources and covering this as a huge breaking story that, of course, the whole of Australia is interested in, not just the local community.
It's now Wednesday the 7th of February, 9 o'clock in the morning. Rain has been falling constantly for over 24 hours. Creeks and waterways are starting to flood. The Bruce and Flinders highways north and south of Townsville are closed. The city is effectively isolated. Rob, the Bureau is now issuing cyclone warning updates every 3 hours. You predict the cyclone will now make landfall and hit Townsville in the early hours of Thursday, less than 24 hours away. There is always a chance with cyclones that they can veer off in another direction, but at the moment the path seems steady. The Premier, the Mayor, the police, the emergency services, they're all looking to you for some certainty. What's the nature of your communication with them? What can you say?
We're still warning a swathe of the coast that they have to prepare for cyclone impact. So we wouldn't be focusing on Townsville. We'd be talking about a swathe of the coast at 24 hours out, perhaps 50 or 60 kilometres either side of it, and just telling you need to prepare as if you're going to get a direct hit from a cyclone. We're starting to talk about timing, the high tide, and looking at different scenarios on how much freeboard there is on the tide, and trying to give the best possible information to allow people to make decisions. You're kind of in it's the last waltz now. You've been talking people in for 3 or 4 days and sometimes a week out from these events, and it's this making sure that you're dotting the I's now to give the best possible information right up to when the weather starts to develop.
Mayor, the airport is shut, roads are cut, supermarket shelves are empty, there's almost no bottled water left on the shelves. There may well be food shortages after the cyclone hits, and the news from the Bureau is that towns up to 60 k's north of Townsville are also likely to cop this cyclone as well. There's that eerie, deserted feeling over the streets of Townsville. Your message to people in Townsville now is what?
Our message is to make sure you've got enough food and water, clean water for 3 days, to ensure that you've worked out your evacuation plan. If you've decided to move, you'll be staying with family or friends, to find a room in the house that you can all congregate in, bring in some mattresses, and be prepared to bunker down that night for the cyclone, for it to hit. We'd be, in terms of the council itself, we'd be preparing to make sure that we've got all our reservoirs filled, because we can assume we're going to lose power. We'll be making sure that our disaster coordination centre is ready to be manned after the event. It would have been manned prior to the event, helping to get out all the information for both the district as well as for EMQ, to keep that message running through and to answer all those inquiries from people.
Premier, Alan and the ABC are getting the message out, but they're also giving you a shellacking, as is the media generally. And this is before the cyclone even makes landfall. They're questioning how well organised the evacuation plan is. Your spin doctors are saying that you need to respond to claims that the evacuation plans are a mess. Do you have time to worry about this? Or are there more important things on your plate right now?
In a disaster event, the most important role of any leader is to calm the community and to give a sense of direction. So, contrary to the advice, we would have to continue to not just work with the media, but deal with the issues that have been raised. There is no time for finger pointing in a disaster. You have to suck up the criticism and get on with it. We would very clearly continue to get messages out, and in that last day, it is so important to do two things. The first is to reinforce the message that the Mayor said about what your preparations are, but the second is to say this may be the last time that you hear from us.
Because the power's going to go off.
Indeed. So they have to know that the steps have been taken to give all the certainty possible. You need to inform them that you have brought generators in, that staff from the Reconstruction Authority are there on the ground waiting to serve them the next day, that Ergon's geared up, that the SES are on board, the EMQ, they need that confidence at that time. So with or without the blessing of the media, with or without the criticism being justified or not, you have to suck it up and get on with it.
If I can come to Glenn Fisher from the Australian Defence Force. Glenn, the ADF has a huge presence in Townsville. What facilities are at greatest risk from Cyclone Claudia, and how are you going about protecting your assets and indeed your personnel right now, many of whom would never have lived through anything like this before?
Yeah, Paul, in lead with what the Mayor and Glenn has been pointed out, the Defence will already be inside the DDMG, so it's already taken the lead from the local organisations of what's required. The Defence itself would also be in its own planning module, so it would have already identified platforms, equipment that needed to be moved out of the impact area so that it can be either reused or used in the recovery and the response. Personnel-wise, we have a very good welfare organisation already set up, which also provides information for new families moving into the region. We also have a lot of information throughout the cyclone season. It's provided by most emergency services to provide additional information. So,
do you have to move planes and so on off the tarmacs?
Correct. We'll move most of those bigger platforms outside the impact area, and that will again be based on the information we're getting from the bomb, the information we're getting from the local organisations. But we'll be moving far enough away so that they're not outside the reach if they're required to be used.
What about social media, Facebook, Twitter? That started to go off right about now. Warnings are being issued via the Mayor's office. The police have been getting involved. They're using the hashtag TC Claudia and the hashtag myth-busting to combat some of the misinformation that's now starting to surface about the cyclone. You need to communicate with your families. Are you going to hop on Twitter and Facebook as well?
Well, in today's society, soldiers will. They will be there. Our biggest thing is that we take our lead from our local disaster management groups, the districts. Sorry, we take the lead. We follow them, but there's always going to be that soldier that needs to communicate with his family, and regardless of whether they're in Townsville or outside Townsville, they want to make sure that they're providing the best for them. Defence has already got that set up. On previous incidents, Defence have released those members who can be released back to their families to ensure that they're doing the same preparation as everybody else. But again, on the same side, we maintain enough staff and enough organisation and equipment that can provide assistance if needed.
The Heatley cyclone shelter is now over capacity with people seeking refuge from the storm. There are 900 or so people squeezed inside. 4,000 others are now hunkered down in various places of refuge in Townsville. All the doors are locked. But of course, most people are at home. Some people have remained against all warnings in the storm surge zone, hoping for the best, and the city's bedded down for a tough night as it prepares for a Cyclone Yasi type weather event to hit.
You can see that large amounts of water are pushed fast towards the land. Water shaded in red is the fastest moving, and water shaded in blue is moving the slowest. In this simulation, water enters the low-lying regions of Townsville City through the port of Townsville along Ross Creek and starts to spread through low-lying areas such as Townsville City, South Townsville, Town Common, Rose Bay and the Railway Estate.
One of the early events that caused a lot of loss of life was in 1896 in January when Tropical Cyclone Sigma hovered around just offshore from Townsville, and the wave action and the storm surge there killed about 18 people, and bearing in mind it was a pretty small town in those days. The worst recent cyclone that has caused damage from these effects was Cyclone Althea on Christmas Eve 1971. Althea hit Townsville at low tide, so the ultimate, probably worst case scenario would be a Yasi cyclone hitting Townsville at high tide.
And undoubtedly some people are thinking about the past as Cyclone Claudia speeds up and makes landfall near Townsville Harbour at 3 in the morning on Thursday the 8th of February. The massive surge is nearly 4 metres on top of the highest astronomical tide of over 2 metres, and wind speeds hit 285 k's at Claudia's core. Nobody knows how many people have remained in the surge zone. Over on Magnetic Island, just off the coast, things seem to be under control. Only a small number of people there have waterfront homes that are vulnerable, and those residents have taken refuge up on the hill. But Palm Island, 70 k's off the coast of Townsville, is squarely in the path of Claudia. 4,000 people live there. The decision to evacuate was made, but there wasn't enough time to get all of them over to the mainland by ferry and plane. 1,500 people are left behind, exposed to the surge and to massive winds. Alan Sunderland, you're in charge of the ABC's coverage of Claudia. You've got the scoop on Palm Island. Over 1,000 Indigenous people stuck on an island as the cyclone hits, no way to bring them to Townsville, and you're also the emergency broadcaster. How do you handle the competing demands of aiding public safety and avoiding panic, but also shining a light on an important, possibly inflammatory story?
There's no real conflict, as far as I can see, between those two. Accuracy and completeness is the solution always. The flow of official information from official sources remains, but we can't get out to Palm Island any more than anyone else can. But thanks to the superb rollout of the NBN around the country in the last few years, we know there's lots of people communicating back from that community. They're using social media, they're using platforms, everybody's got a camera. We are going through our normal verification processes to get access to that content, to curate it and to report it and to bring it to the community. People have a right to know what's going on, and you can do that in a way that's not sensational and not alarmist.
And they're posting on Facebook that they're angry about the fact they couldn't get off the island. They think the evacuation has been completely botched. Do you run with that, just as you're trying to calm people down as well?
You absolutely run with that. People have a right to be heard. You run with that, and of course you always go to the authorities, you go to the Premier, you go to the Mayor, you get the official response and the reaction and engagement. And it's always done in a proportional way. When there's a major disaster happening, the biggest story is what is actually happening at the time. There is opportunity for recriminations and blame later, and we'll get into that. Don't you worry about that.
But the police and the Premier are saying, we thought you were on our side. We thought you were here to help us to deal with this natural disaster. We didn't know you were going to start kicking us in the head.
We normally spend a fair bit of time explaining to the government and the Mayor that we're not on their side, that we are on the side of the people.
We know that.
Glenn, from the police, the ABC is reporting that over 1,000 people are stuck on Palm Island and in danger of Cyclone Claudia. Already we know there's tension between Palm Islanders and some of the white fellas. What are you doing? What are you saying to reassure the community on Palm Island?
We engage with them. Our local disaster management group over there is actually set up within one of our complexes. That's the council staff coming to one of our complexes, and we'll be engaging with the community through the mayor and seeking to allay the community's concerns. It's always a challenge, the management of these situations, but it's, as Mr. Christophilly says, it's relaying a positive message, being reassuring, and it's placating fears where we can. It's, we must portray a consistent message. And that's part of the challenge.
Wayne, the Palm Islanders who do get to Townsville decide they aren't going to go to the shelter that you've directed them to. They want to catch up with some people they haven't seen for a while in Townsville. Are you responsible for their well-being?
No, I'm not. To go back though, what we need to be mindful of, we don't evacuate Magnetic Island, so let's focus on, we don't evacuate all the islands off the coast. We've worked extensively with Palm Island's local disaster management group. At this stage they don't have a shelter, but there's plans in place to stage the evacuation back to housing that's built after 1984, and David will talk about that shortly, that they would be safe on the island. So we need to focus on, we don't evacuate Magnetic Island, just because Palm Island's Palm Island, don't focus on that aspect of it. That they would be, if they moved away from the red zones, we've just identified their zones over there, out of the surge zone, they should be okay. People generally don't get killed by flying debris. It's getting them out of that water from the storm surge.
And Premier, you're happy there are enough homes built to the new building code that those remaining on Palm Island can take refuge in those better designed houses and they'll be safe?
Indeed, and they've been rolled out over the course of the last half a decade. But to go to the crux of what Alan raised, you still have to address it in two parts, and the media has every right to raise an issue as they see as a shortcoming. So how I would address that is by saying, okay, a decision was taken to evacuate, wrongly or rightly. That decision meant that 1,500 people weren't able to get off the island. You acknowledge that. You give people the assurance that that will be investigated at a time when you've got through the worst. Then you say to the 1,500 people, however, you have ample opportunity to get to here. You must go there before this period of time. You will be safe there. The important thing during a disaster is to actually look people in the eye and say, you must make a decision. Once you've made the decision, you've got to stick it out. The worst thing is to flip-flop after the decision has been made. And so provided you can acknowledge the opportunity for review afterwards, but give certainty during a crisis, people are in good spirits.
Robert Cedar, you're a respected Indigenous leader in Townsville. What do you imagine is happening on Palm Island right now as just as the cyclone hits? How are the residents coping?
There's a lot of fear and confusion around the community. And it comes back to, I think, what Mayor Hill touched on previously is around education and clear communication of the process through that. And so I think if we can look at promoting what the disaster recovery management team are looking at into a community level, I think, a lot of those barriers and issues might be, confronted before the big disaster, because that information isn't being flown down throughout all the communities, because we're sort of getting what's on media, and for locations like Palm Island, media is not a big sort of a media outlet over there. So, it's around your texting and also on Facebook. So it's about educating more than anything else around the community.
David Henderson from the Cyclone Testing Station at James Cook University. Townsville has thousands of homes that have been built before the newer building code regulations came into force, and even some of the newer homes haven't been maintained properly in the city. What's happening to these homes as they're being battered by wind speeds of 250 k's, and how safe are the people taking shelter inside?
Well, with the wind speeds, as they're increasing, some of maybe the more older, more poorly maintained houses may start to lose elements of their roof structure. That's obviously letting a lot of wind-driven rain into the structure. Be terrified if you're inside it. If you've taken the advice of the mayor and the emergency services, where you've hunkered down in the smallest room of the house or the bathroom toilet area, away from the external walls, put the mattresses around you, You've got some of the protection of those other walls helping to protect from the wind-driven debris, but it will be a terrifying experience.
What's the effect of roller doors disengaging from their tracks and windows that have been put in by the dodgy DIY guy down the road and them blowing in? Are these real risks that we're seeing unfolding around town?
Well, we saw a lot of those types of issues, some of those issues after Cyclones Larry and Cyclone Yasi. So following that, there's been a real change in the building codes and standards, say for roller doors and better fixings of componentry. So newer roller doors since Cyclone Yasi should be cyclonic rated. If you've got the older versions, they may well be blown in or even sucked out depending on which the wind direction is, and they may be actually hammering your own house, flapping around in the wind. Again, you've taken the advice, you've sheltered in the central part of your house in the strongest area. So again, if there's a heap of noise and vibration, everything going on, you're not going outside to try to tie something down in this wind speed. You've got your tail between your legs and you're hoping for the best.
3 o'clock in the afternoon on Thursday, Claudia has passed. It's now safe to leave the shelters and refuges, but those evacuated from the storm surge evacuation zones, of course, can't return home till it's safe to do so. Outside, it frankly looks like a war zone. Trees are uprooted everywhere, debris is scattered throughout the streets, huge numbers of power lines are down. Ergon is warning that every power line has to be treated as live. Power substations are damaged. There's almost no power unless you have your own generator, and Townsville is still cut off. There's no transport in and out of the city. No buses even to move people from the shelters back to their home. Premier, instantly there's pressure for everything to be fixed immediately. But it's not even clear how many houses are destroyed. We haven't even accounted for people in the storm surge zone. What's your tone right now speaking to locals?
To assure people that the recovery will take place, but to also give the message that they are of no use to themselves or their families to go into those affected areas. I know that is difficult to deliver that message to people, and I saw that in North Bundaberg. The first thing people want to do is return to their home. They want to see it and touch it and feel it, but they are of no use to themselves or their family when there's power lines dangling like spaghetti squid. You just absolutely have to give the message to people that they will return when it is safe to return, and we will be there to help the clean-up process. And that's when knowing that the authorities are there to lead that charge and to lead the recovery will give people comfort. But in the initial stages, you have to put the preservation of life ahead of people's good feelings, and that's tough to do but must be done.
Mayor, what's your key message to the citizens of Townsville now? How do you reassure them, especially given that communications are down? They can't even get in contact with one another to check out whether they're safe or not.
Well, that's from our perspective. Obviously, we'd use media. We can use text messaging because you'd assume that, and we found that in Cyclone Larry, that while you couldn't use phones for some reason, the mobile networks seemed to survive. So we'd be looking to use those sort of things to get the message out there to the community. Tell them that, and what we always say, please stay in your homes, don't go out. Reassure your own family, get that settled. And that's really what we want people to do. We'll be out there with the police, with the state government. We'll be getting people to do the assessments and beginning the process, prioritising the work that needs to be done and working with all the agencies to make sure things do happen.
Shane Williams from the Townsville Storms Facebook page, how have you managed in the midst of this crisis to keep your Facebook page live and current as audience numbers have exploded, hits have exploded? How are you even able to moderate the conversation without access to phones or internet?
The social media is only as good as what the communications are available to you at the time, so especially in a disaster event like that, we'll be using mobile phone technology to continue that. We do actually have a team of administrators that do run the Facebook page, and each is responsible for each particular event, such as flood information being posted, any latest warnings, that sort of thing. So it can be quite hectic, but we do have certain people that do post that information out.
And Glenn Catchell, the police are also employing social media strategy at this stage?
Most certainly, it's critical. It's one of the areas we've really moved into in recent years, and we're able to touch a far wider audience and at all times, let alone during times of crisis.
And Shane Williams, people trust what's being put on Facebook, perhaps more than they trust the mainstream media, would you say?
They do, to a certain degree they can, or they do trust what information is being posted on Facebook, but then again, the way our focus is that we ensure that information that gets put out there is from official sources and where it came from.
Okay. And that ends our second chapter of the discussion. Thanks.
You spent a couple of days in a local shelter and you were hoping that very soon you can go back home and start your life again, where you left it off, only to realize that there is no home to go. Everything's been destroyed, the power's been cut off, the gas doesn't work, the roads are not usable, schools are closed, shops are closed. There are a lot of people around, a lot of noise, a lot of sirens. It's a mess. So you wonder how you're going to repair your life and move on after such a devastating event. What does it mean for a community to respond immediately after disaster? How resilient is community to respond to event after disaster?
Okay, it's Friday. 2 days have now elapsed since the cyclone struck. Outside it continues to rain, and there are now gruesome discoveries of bodies amidst the debris. Who knows how many have died, and who knows how the population will cope when they emerge to fully comprehend the devastation. It's being dubbed Townsville's Hurricane Katrina moment. Mayor, there's a lot that we still don't know about the impact of Claudia and the flooding, but you do know that this is much worse than previous cyclones, and that what unfolds will be bad. Homes destroyed, some people have died, an extended period without power or communications. How do you address those short-term needs, like getting the supermarket shelves restacked? And when do you start to think and deal with the longer-term challenges, like getting the tourism sector back on its feet, which is critical for Townsville?
What we really have to do is look at not just food, but it's about making sure we can supply water to people, we get the sewage treatment plants going again, we can help to clear roads. In terms of ensuring the shelves are stocked, we would put in what we call an RFA, request for assistance, take it up through the district and into the state to start to get movements of food back into the city. If the roads are still blocked, we'd be looking at coastal shipping to ship as much in as quickly as possible, because ultimately that's the only way we'll get the bulk supplies in. In the interim, if the airports are open, or if there's a way we can airlift food in with the assistance of the Army, that's why we use those RFAs to get that assistance, and we drive that back up into the system.
Debbie Thompson from the Townsville Hospital. There have been 3 heart attacks. One person's died because an ambulance simply couldn't get there in time in the midst of all this crisis. Someone's been hit by a falling tree. Another is badly electrocuted by a power line. Hundreds of people have turned up to casualty, and up to 400 people, just to make matters worse, at the Heatley Cyclone Refuge have come down with bad gastro. The emergency room's in chaos. There's a traffic jam outside because the roads are buggered. How do you manage all of this?
Paul, we've got some wonderful plans in place, but we'd work with the District Disaster Group and we would ask for our health functional plan to be enacted, which means that our health incident controller at the hospital would take over the health resources in the district. So we would use our private facilities, our GPs, and we would use the assistance of QAS and Defence, and we would set up air hospitals, I guess you would call them, around the place, and we would use QES to divert different categories of patients to different areas. So we would have also had DAC requests and requests through Queensland Health to get support from the southeast corner. And obviously it takes time to do that, but we would be working as best we can to get the support in the right place.
You would have had extra doctors, extra nurses, extra staff waiting for this moment.
We would have had them on standby before the cyclone crossed the coast. We potentially would have had pre-deployed teams in Townsville before that happened. Given the scenario that we were facing, we probably would have had those teams either sitting in Townsville or ready to be deployed.
You've got these hundreds of people, though, down the road at the Heatley Cyclone Shelter who are really crook. I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's an ugly mess down there at the moment. The roads are blocked. It's pretty unsafe still to drive. How do you get doctors and nurses out there to help these people?
Again, we work with Queensland Police Service to navigate roads. It's the same with Queensland Ambulance Service. We have to get best access as we can to get our staff to those areas. We would pre-deploy teams with appropriate equipment to treat those patients. Gastroenteritis, fluid, decontamination. So the right equipment at the right place to treat the right people.
And you've got enough beds to fit all the people in the hospital that you'll need to deal with?
So the way we deal with things is we talk about people, space and stuff. So the right people in the right place, the right stuff and the right resources.
Premier, it's one of those times where a community needs leadership. The public are really craving it right now, as they were all those years ago when Brisbane and southeast Queensland came to a standstill after the floods. What do you say to people? They've lost everything, they've woken up to a devastated city, they can't even get in contact to find whether their relatives are okay. The whole nation is listening to you right now, and there's some signs of generosity too, people prepared to donate. But you need to take control of the situation without even knowing what the full situation is.
Well, the first thing you've got to give is that assurance that the job will be done and will be seen through the entire way. An important part, which you raised before, was that drawing that analogy with Katrina. That's something that has to be stopped immediately, because the issue with Katrina was that people felt that they hadn't been heard, that they hadn't been listened, that no one cared, and quite frankly that was the case. It took so long for authorities to mobilise. So I would actually pick up the phone and ring somebody like Alan and say, if history shows this, by all means, go hard, but that's not the time to do that, because you touched on tourism. Your first responsibility is not to have the tourism industry back up on its feet, because quite frankly we know that people aren't going to buy it and they're not going to come straight away. You've got to give support to the tourist business and indeed all sorts of businesses to keep them alive, but recovery always has to be in three phases. The first is that immediate restoration, keeping people safe, making sure that the drinking water's there and the sewerage is functioning. Then there's the bigger rebuild, and part of that rebuild is the business rebuild, and that cannot occur if you do not have confidence. And the moment that the community senses that there isn't confidence and that they aren't being heard and that they aren't being actioned, all of that can fall in a big heap.
Alan Sunderland from the ABC, the Premier and the Mayor have both emerged safe and sound, and they're attempting to calm the population down, but they're facing a barrage of tough questions from the media in their first press conference, especially around the evacuation. It was either too heavy-handed or it wasn't heavy-handed enough. The questions are coming from all directions. Wasn't enough warning. How does the demeanour and the confidence of these two leaders affect those in Townsville who are watching?
It has a huge impact. Keep in mind this is only a small part of the story. The time frame we're talking about at the moment, a lot of the area is still underwater, there's still major problems. Our main focus is on getting our reporters to the hospital, getting our reporters to where people are and telling those human stories. But the press conferences of the leaders are a crucial part of it, and we are crucially responsible in sending that out. And what I think people pick up on immediately and is most crucial is when somebody is open and honest with them and is calling it as it is. So it's not a time for spin, it's not a time for messaging, it's a time for information and clarity. And the leaders who get that across are the ones that seem to get the cut through on the message at times like this.
Tony O'Connor, you run Kookaburra Tours. You're at that stage now where you're thinking that your business is going to be out of action for a while, but you're just starting to think about how on earth to get things back again as soon as possible, both for your own sake and, of course, you employ staff and People need incomes, even during time, perhaps even more so in times of natural disaster. But the reality is there is no tourism without tourists, and there's little prospect of tourists returning in the short term. What do you need to do to convince the tourists that they ought think about returning to Townsville? How do you possibly get that message out when people are seeing these images on the TV screens every night?
Yeah, our first priority would be to make sure that we got our region safe and back moving forward, and to do that with our own businesses, our transport and our accommodation, we would be looking to firstly accommodate clean-up crews to come through and dispatch them across the region, so that you could get the whole region moving forward. Then we would actually follow up by getting in and helping each other, basically get our front door open and putting on that open for business, utilising social media, whatever we can do. Once we've got through those earlier stages of getting clean-up crews through and just making sure that everybody was safe and we could move.
News has just come through that it's confirmed 15,000 homes have been inundated by the storm tide or damaged by the winds. The apartment blocks in the middle of town have been flooded, and because the plant equipment is in the basement, that means there's no power on in any of those apartments, and the homes that have been flooded are filled with about 10 centimetres of silt. The newer homes, as expected, have fared better. The older homes and those not well maintained have lost roofs, even walls. And Facebook and Twitter are full of rumours that the storm surges are not covered by insurance. Will I be covered by insurance is the question everybody is now asking. Tony Coleman, you're an insurance expert. The brutal truth about natural disasters is that some people are covered and some people aren't covered. How does the insurance industry as a whole have a conversation with those who are affected about whether or not they have storm surge coverage?
Actually, this is a pretty straightforward one. Storm surge is, by all reputable insurers, particularly when resulting from a cyclone, is covered. It's not like flood, or not like how flood used to be. So they're covered.
They are clearly covered. Everybody is covered.
In a situation as you've described, they'll be covered.
And
assuming they've got valid insurance.
Who are the people in Townsville who are potentially exposed to not having coverage?
Somebody who hasn't bought an insurance policy, or people who, for whatever reason, may have been underinsured.
And all of the people who have insurance policies, they're covered?
They should be, yes.
What about movement of water that is not, strictly speaking, a storm surge?
Well, this clearly is. I don't think there's much doubt about that. So, there has been developments in the insurance industry over the last 5 years, particularly since the Brisbane floods, where flooding used to be a problem, but flooding is quite different from storm surge. It's defined differently, and this is clearly related to a cyclone, which clearly is a covered event. I don't really think it's going to be an issue.
Brian Balthorpe from Ergon Energy. Power is out for hundreds of thousands of people in and beyond Townsville. The weather event has affected almost 25% of your total customer base. You're facing a crisis of unprecedented magnitude. You have substations that need to be repaired, transmission towers that have been seriously damaged. It's a huge task requiring the largest deployment of workers and resources in Ergon's history. How do you prioritise the needs? Key infrastructure versus local households and so on?
Sure. Well, obviously safety is the highest priority, both for the community and for the responders. We've got fairly well developed emergency management plans to deal with these situations. On an event of this scale, we would obviously, as soon as it's safe to do so, we'd be out scoping the damage across the community, and then prioritising the infrastructure and restoring on that basis. So we'd be looking at water treatment, sewage treatment, communication sites, supermarkets, hospitals, and getting them on first. Clearing up the fallen power lines that was discussed before, very important. From a safety perspective, that has to be done at the very beginning of the response to allow other responders to get in. We would pre-position generators, materials, supplies into the region in advance, as we would have some warning of this. We'd barge equipment into the area if roads are still cut off, or fly it in.
Do you have a time frame for getting a reasonable degree of power back up in the city?
It will really depend on the situation. It would have to be determined
because
by
that's what the public want to know.
Absolutely.
When can I turn on my power?
Yep.
Days or weeks?
As soon as we know, have some idea of the scope, we'd be communicating with customers through social media if that's still functioning. The time frame is really dependent on the event. So we would be obviously mobilising our own resources as quickly as we can. We'd mobilise resources from outside the region. We mobilise resources from Energex and southern entities, and bring them up in a fairly large logistical exercise to get that restored as quickly as we can.
Rachel Cliff from Telstra. Everybody wants to get on the phone right now to check that their family and friends are safe, but tens of thousands of telephone landlines are down. Mobile coverage is spotty. Those Telstra mobile towers do have solar power and backup batteries, but there's been no sunlight for days and days. What do you focus on first?
Look, our network is a resilient network. After Cyclone Yassi, there was very little physical damage to our network, and what really impacts us is power. So as a utility, we often get very close to ergon at this time and prioritise our sites, our core sites that need power restoration. But we've been preparing for this, the hit of Cyclone for 5 days. So we've refuelled all our generators at all our key sites. We've got generators at all our key sites. We've got additional staff that man those, refuel those, have already been deployed. They're here in Townsville on the ground doing that work today. But for us, our priority is our core network, which is the tree trunk of our network. We need to make sure that's working first. And then mobiles and landlines, so people can call E000 in emergencies.
Well, mobiles become very important because the power is off. And these days, everybody's got those phones that are powered by electricity, the cordless phone.
It is part of our education piece for our customers, is on our Facebook page, is at the start of every cyclone and before a cyclone, as soon as a cyclone is announced, we start talking about preparedness at home, having that old phone in the cupboard with the touch buttons that's not connected to power, a way that you can recharge your mobile, so either a car charger or another kind of way you can charge your mobile phone. So they're the things that we educate our customers about before the event, and then, obviously trying to get services up as soon as we possibly can, and we station key personnel in our big exchanges through those events to make sure that we're on the ground and can get to that very quickly.
The Townsville Storm Facebook page has by now clocked an astonishing 50 million individual post views on hashtag TC Claudia. It's trending nationally on Twitter. It's impossible for the conventional media and indeed for the Premier to stay ahead of the story that is unfolding on social media. Police can't get information out quickly enough. Shane Williams from the Townsville Storms, your page has become the voice of the storm, effectively, more so than the mainstream media, it would seem. Your team are now running it from Cairns, not Townsville, meaning it's hard to keep across what's actually happening on the ground. How do you stay grounded in the community when the facts and the emergency priorities are so key? And what's your role in the days and weeks ahead?
Of course, our primary focus still remains on the areas affected, so those of whom are outside that area, such as you mentioned, Cairns, would continue to be sourcing information that is available locally to the best of their ability. So it can be quite difficult when communications are down or at minimum capacity, though we will still try and endeavour to get as much information from official sources, of course from the general public as well, because there will be a handful of people out there that still will be posting their own information to the page, which is clearly visible to everyone else publicly.
It is now 2 weeks since Claudia and the storm surge. Some things are getting back to normal. The airport's up and running, bringing in teams of emergency workers. The ADF has been assigned to help with the recovery by the Prime Minister. The supermarkets have been restocked thanks to a supply ship. Ergon's restored most of the power and the sewerage problems have been rectified, and Telstra's reconnected about half of the landlines, but the mobile coverage is still a bit patchy. And the highways have still not reopened, but the human toll is unimaginable. 106 people have died during and after the storm, the death toll highest in the storm surge zones, and 32 people have lost their lives on Palm Island, prompting a massive outcry. Robert Cedar, you are an Indigenous leader at a time of great mourning among your community. The loss of life has really devastated people. But what's your focus on now? Is your focus on rage, or is your focus on moving forward?
I think, Paul, on both, because you will have a bit of anger and frustration because it comes along with fear. So it's about, educating the community and working with the community to look at a holistic approach by the services that are providing a service to Palm Island and all communities. But it's keeping the information, I think the clarity of the information needs to be short and sharp and to the point and achievable. And to ease the burden of community people, not only around the well-being of their family, is my home insured, where am I going to live afterwards, and what's thereafter the cleanup. Where do we go from here? So,
and you're the conduit to the Indigenous community in Townsville and out on the island. What's your message to the community now? Because like the general community, there's a great deal of uncertainty and concern. What can you say to address that? And anger and fear, as you say. How can you address that?
It comes back to pretty much communication and education, because the effects of a disaster like that affects everyone. And there is strategies in place in their local government, but also in services as well. So we need to promote those to the community member to deal with the emotional stress and other impacts on families and also on the island, and service delivery of fresh food and other resources.
Rachel, you're getting more and more complaints at Telstra because all the phones aren't switched on. How are you managing these escalating complaints?
How we're managing the escalated complaints. Look, we've got teams that we've brought into the region to rectify services as soon as we possibly can. Our focus, of course, is mobiles and landlines by this stage, because our core network is well and truly up and running. So, as soon
That's your focus, but people are just not taking your word for anything now. They're still without a phone, and are your people in the call centres there taking these complaints? Are they feeling a bit weary by it all by now?
Yeah, during a natural disaster, all the calls are actually routed through Townsville's call centre. So anyone who picks up a phone is actually answered in Townsville. So, and that's across Australia. I'm on the phone talking to ABC. I'm also on the phone talking to 4TO, and we've also got our own social media page, the Telstra Townsville Facebook page, and we're providing updates to people about what we're doing to restore services and when their area is going to be up and running again.
Debbie, the Townsville Hospital throughout all this crisis have miraculously not missed a beat. It was undamaged from the storm, able to continue its critical operations unaffected. How has the hospital managed to fare so well in terms of the building? Are there design features of the Townsville Hospital that's been able to protect this critical building during a natural disaster?
Yes, Paul. So the hospital's not that old, and when it was built, it was architecturally built that the front part of the hospital is a Cyclone designed building, and it has redundancies throughout the entire building. So there are 3 sections to it, all with different utilities, so they all have their own generators, water supply, phone lines coming through them. So at any time we can move services through the three buildings. And in the main building, that's the newest building, holds our emergency department, ICU, theatre buildings and midwifery, so we can keep our vital services running, and we run our emergency operations centre out of there as well. So we've technically built it, again, fire engineered building, so we would never need to evacuate the hospital, and it's been designed that way to keep us in that environment and to keep us safe, and we've built it so that we can expand our capacity as well. So should we have 400 people at the door and major chaos out the road, we can turn clinical areas that would normally be a day clinic, come visit the GP, into an overnight stay area.
Meanwhile, Tony Coleman, people are waiting for their insurance settlement. It's taking some time. People want to get into the business of rebuilding. How long will it take for 5,000 or so claims to get processed through the system? There are some people still stuck in these evacuation zones, unable to get back into their home.
Yeah, it can vary, and it depends, quite frankly, a bit on the insurer. One of the fortunate things about a cyclone for an insurer is that you get about 2 or 3 days notice that it's coming, unlike an earthquake or a bushfire. And of course, insurers are used to having to deal with lots of different disasters. It's kind of part of what they have to do. Normally, the bigger insurers anyway will have mobilised before the storm and have brought resources, and particularly claims assessing resources close to the area or even into the area before the storm hits, so that they've actually resourced to be able to do that. And they would usually, actually quite in contrast to Telstra, interestingly, use their resources from outside the state, mainly telephonic, in order to be able to process claims more rapidly, rather than having to rely on concentrated resources close to the area. So they put a lot of effort into doing that, trying to give people food vouchers to give them immediate money, that sort of thing as well.
You've got thousands of minor claims coming through as well. Are they clogging up the system?
Sure, it's always a huge workload, but you know, insurers have a lot of contingency plans for these sort of events. I mean, it's part of their normal business, and so those sort of plans come into effect, and they can maximise the resources they bring from other parts of Australia and New Zealand in order to focus on a particular event like this.
Councillor Jenny Hill, the Mayor, just as the insurance situation is becoming clearer, there's a new complaint emerging. Why did the Townsville City Council allow development to take place in the storm surge affected zones? Didn't they take notice of Cyclone Althea's damage in the 70s, or did they imagine it couldn't happen again?
Oh, look, things have changed since the 70s. Building designs, understanding of flood levels. We have had some legacy issues in the past. I mean, everyone wants to move close to the beach. How do you say to people, well, I could live there in the past, why can't I live there now? So we've got to live with those legacy issues. We've tried to implement, or we have implemented, particularly in the new schemes, certain levels of buildings that have to be built at ground heights, so they don't, or they shouldn't receive what we would consider normal stormwater inundation. You're talking about a 4-metre storm surge here now. The difficulty is with that, we've seen water come right up into places like Annandale, which are about 6 kilometres off the coast. So it's difficult to say you can never build here in Townsville, because by rights it is a floodplain. We will see water come through. It's really about just creating that resilience in the community.
Hello everyone. Tropical cyclone Damien, which has been menacing the tropics over the last few days, is heading towards the coast. So it seems highly likely the already soaked and battered North Tropical coastal region is in for another major cyclonic event. Further torrential rain and destructive winds are on their way. Currently, Damien's located 125 kilometres northeast of Townsville. It's heading southeast, that's parallel to the coast, and moving very slowly, just 3 kilometres per hour. It is weakening as it gets closer, down to a Category 2 now, but it will still pack a punch. Destructive winds of up to 140 kilometres per hour expected. Let's have a look at the latest track map, and the warning area extends from Cardwell again right down to Proserpine and then inland to Charters Towers. We've already had reports of gales between Bowen and Lucinda, and that's going to extend south down to Shoalwater Bay. There will be very heavy rainfall as the system's moving so slowly, and flash flooding's likely between Cairns and Mackay. Double-up events like this are not unprecedented, as Jeff Callaghan, meteorologist and former senior forecaster with the Bureau, explains.
Yes, in 1967, 5 cyclones and 3 East Coast lows hit the Gold Coast, causing massive erosion. Then in 1958-59, 2 severe cyclones hit Bowen, and then in 1893, 4 cyclones over 26 days hit the Brisbane area. So it's not unprecedented.
Almost unbelievably, on Wednesday the 6th of March, the Bureau of Meteorology issues a new warning of a low pressure system forming off Cape York, which is heading south. The city braces again. This is every emergency manager's nightmare. Back-to-back emergencies, an impending flood on the top of a cyclone. Rob Webb from the Bureau's been criticised for focusing on Cyclone Damien, which has become a bit of a fizzer as far as the wind is concerned, more than the severe rainfall and the impact that the rain is having as a result of flooding. Too many residents were not prepared for the flooding. How do you respond to that criticism?
Well, throughout a lot of the messaging with these events, we'd be talking about the wind damage from the cyclone, but also we would have such things as severe weather warnings out for the flooding, flood warnings out for coastal rivers. So it's about getting people prepared. We understand that the community's going to be very sensitive to getting the best possible information. At this point in time, it's really important that consistent information goes out, consistent official information. There's a great thirst for information, but we'll be very mindful of trying to get good quality information to the people who need it.
Premier, a metre of rain has fallen from the Thursday until the following Tuesday after Damien. Water's had to be released into from the Ross River Dam into the river. There's water everywhere. These back-to-back weather events are a nightmare for those emergency crews still working on the cyclone clean-up. And there is some concern about the possibility of major industrial pollution as the heavy rain has damaged infrastructure. Are you worried at all about the potential of the 3 smelters and refineries around Townsville to cause environmental damage to Great Barrier Reef, which of course is the jewel in the Queensland tourism crown?
Of course we are, but once it's reached that point, there is very little you can do to mitigate against it. And when you're dealing with huge loss of life and when you're dealing with having to reconnect a community and preparing it for the next one, that is a debate for a future time. And so it is with a number of the other things we've discussed today, and that is things like how we've handled the social media and how we've handled the town planning issues. All of those things are crucial, and you must look the community in the eye and assure them that it will get investigated. But the time for reprisal is always after, when you're dealing with a big event like this. The time for going after the owners of the refineries for their processes will come in due course. Right now, what the community needs is the assurance that they will get through the flooding and they will continue to rebuild, and that another event won't impede what is a recovery that needs to take place weeks down the track.
Wayne Preedy, North Queensland's emergency management capacity is stretched to the hilt. Volunteers are exhausted. They need to get back to their day jobs. Now the police and emergency services have to manage 2 recoveries at once. Plus, there's all of the flooded communities downstream of Bowen who've been affected by this. Are you guys up to the task?
Locally, we would probably do what we've done last time. Once our volunteers have used all available resources, we'll bring them in from other states, and actually we brought them in from New Zealand last time as well. Look, Australian volunteers, whether they be in Queensland or throughout Australia, have that great community spirit, and they'll all be keen to come here. So we tend to spend more time holding them back than actually dealing with the weather event. So once our resources are exhausted, we'd be bringing them in from other parts of Queensland or other parts of Australia.
Mayor, how do you build resilience in the community now? Back-to-back disasters, one obviously a lot bigger than the other, but a real sense that they're like a boxer that's got back up after being knocked to the canvas only to have another blow hit them. In your role as Mayor, are you able to assist? North Queenslanders are tough, but this is really wearing them.
Oh, look, and if you were to get more flooding, it would wear you down. But you've got to remain positive. This is an event that is unexpected. We're tough. We can deal with it here. Yeah, we've got the mechanisms, and you just have to keep that positive attitude and keep working through it. The community would have probably just gotten on its feet 2 weeks out, the flooding. It's not unexpected at that time of year. But as I said, if the plans held up during the Category 5 cyclone, they'll certainly hold up for flooding.
Tony O'Connor from Kookaburra Tours, another blow now for the tourism sector. How do you even think about selling the message that we're open for business in Townsville The roads have been damaged again. Your business, your livelihood is under real pressure now. Are you able to even muster the energy to think ahead for new strategies for bouncing back, both for your business and for the tourism industry as a whole?
Yeah, look, it certainly is very challenging, and we've been through it here a number of times in the region, those of us that have been in business for a long time, about the area. And yeah, certainly very challenging when you're working hard to get your front door open and to sort of maintain key staff, and you're mortgaged, you've got extensions, you're paying wages with credit cards and the like. It is very, very tough going, and networking is just so important, that industry works together, helps each other, and go out with a united approach to media. Certainly media has been a big challenge for us in the past, as in the negative messages that constantly go out around the clock, 24 hours a day. And it is a fine line between, getting the message out that the region needs support, but at the same time, that there are businesses ready for business. Quite often after a cyclone, the weather's fantastic. It's quite ironic. But, to get that message out. And it is a united approach across the industry and our regional tourism organisation.
The heavy rainfall has not only caused sewage outflows and damaged the treatment plant, but as I mentioned, industrial pollution is emerging as a possible threat. The zinc smelters and nickel and copper refineries are reporting damage, and scientists are accordingly measuring what impact is on rivers and the ocean. Alan Sunderland, stories about the Great Barrier Reef have strong public interest, so the ABC is very interested in this. Will the Premier be facing a grilling about the vulnerability of these smelters and refineries?
I'm sure he will. I'm sure as part of what we're doing, we'll be asking those questions. They do say the media is there to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So we'll, having spent the last few weeks comforting the afflicted, we'll probably do a little bit of afflicting. He says that he needs to balance the future economic development of Townsville with the environmental concerns. Your reporter's going to swallow that? Happy to let him say it, and happy to seek other views. And that is where we'll leave this chapter and enter our final chapter for the day.
So we're looking at some really interesting techniques these days in the States, and maybe some of them would apply in Australia. Among them are breakwaters set offshore that sort of break up the waves before they hit a beach, and so that reduces their wave energy. We're also looking at re-engineered dunes that are beautiful. They accommodate wildlife, but they also can be reinforced even with boardwalks or paths or structures. So again, they slow down the waves, they slow down the wave energy. We also are looking at inland bays and streams and ways that we can keep floodwaters and rising seas from so much affecting communities. A lot of this has to do with some natural system techniques, like expanding marshlands and making them work better. We're also slowing down rivers, putting in marshlands, what they call oxbows, that allow the river to twist more so that they will slow down the water and retain it better. And a lot of these techniques can really be amenities for communities. They're not simply walls and levees and rockeries. I'm especially intrigued by a bayside idea I saw, which is making a beautiful riparian edge. In other words, the natural plantings that would attract wildlife at the edge. And then it turns into a kind of small levee, and then on the back of the levee, it becomes little bioswales and other places that retain the water that would flow over. Again, they can become little marshlands. They can be really attractive. So these are just a few of the things we're working on here.
So we're well and truly into the recovery now. It's 3 months after the cyclone hit, and a period of immense planning and rebuilding has started. The Queensland Government and the Townsville City Council have resisted calls for the immediate replacement of damaged infrastructure, the decision has been made there's simply no point making the same expensive mistakes, rebuilding the same way in the same vulnerable locations. The plan is for a better and more resilient Townsville. This is much more difficult, though, than simply replacing like with like, but the political and media battle has been won for now. What recovery design process should Townsville follow? The top-down master planning approach is the most easily controlled, but it's least likely to lead to anything different from what went before. A bottom-up approach where citizens can help create the plan themselves is exciting, but the practicalities are sending shivers down the spine of everyone trying to work out how to deliver value for money and how to get it done in a timely manner. Are there ways of working with nature? Should Townsville pause to consider how other parts of the world are building back better? Premier, are you interested in rebuilding differently? Are you interested in re-engaging with the community, or are you just inclined to get on with the job?
Very much so, and I would point to a track record of doing that and not replacing infrastructure to the same standard in the same location. And we must always have a thirst to do that as leaders, but that can't come at the expense of who you are. So if you're asking whether or not infrastructure should be built stronger, absolutely. If you're after whether or not you should look at things like backflow devices and improving your flood mitigation through things like levees, sure. But if you talk about fundamentally changing who you are as a city and restricting your foreshore and putting many hundreds of metres of wetlands for what is a beautiful foreshore, that is an overreaction to what is a very serious event, but you would not do that right up and down the coast. We all have to live with risk. It is how you mitigate against that risk, but it cannot come at the expense of what makes the identity of your city.
Mayor, you're working closely with the Premier. Are you agreeing with what he's saying there? Is it an overreaction? The environmentalists are putting forward a system similar to what the Premier has described. Whose side are you on?
Well, we used to disagree a bit, but I think on some of these things, you've got to look where the opportunities are. There may be areas where you can look to improve and how quickly you can do that. You've got to be mindful that you don't want to displace your community, because once they leave, they may not come back. So we've got to ensure that we get the people back into the community up and running. So really it's about looking at the opportunities to make the change and to build in the resilience, but without displacing the community and still getting them back into the city. Because remember, a lot of people left. We want them back here again, continuing with their lives.
James Davidson, you're an architect with some experience rebuilding post-disasters. You've studied this area, you've travelled around the world and looked at how other parts of the world have done this. How can a community-led planning process influence the rebuilding and the improvement of Townsville?
I think the biggest issue is an affordability thing. If the ideas aren't actually affordable for people for themselves to be able to implement that at a local scale, then they're just going to keep repeating the mistakes that they've made in the past. And so a lot of the community resilience, like for example in Brisbane after the floods, did help to rebuild in a way that there was some advancement in innovative design where houses could be floodable, for instance. There's a belief that elevation is the salvation of inundation, and that's not necessarily the case. Maybe long term it is with a managed retreat approach, etc. But initially up front, getting people in and safe, and then starting to think about these things in a longer
So you're looking at houses that can, in a sense, accommodate a bit of water running underneath them, but
even
with minor damage, even through them.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
Rather than thinking that you can build a house that will be waterproof altogether.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the higher you go, there's no real. The issue is the datum levels. You can never set them, and the next event might be bigger, and so a lot of people can't actually afford to keep building higher and higher and higher. So what are the innovative ways that we can do? We can actually rebuild public infrastructure, housing, etc., to support that.
David Henderson from James Cook University Cyclone Testing Station. What are the top new building techniques or materials or design features that you think could elevate Townsville's resilience the most? Talking about above and beyond the building code.
Well, the building code just gives you a base level, so we can always go more than that. Within lots of different materials coming out there, there could be other ways of incorporating better thermal efficiencies, larger eaves to get better sun protection, things to actually stop a lot of wind-driven rainwater ingress coming in. They could be the composite panels, insulated cores. But our current house construction that's been changed after Cyclone Tracy, we've learned a lot since then, is still very resilient in these areas. So having our houses constructed to contemporary building codes is still valid in these areas. But we've got to be really mindful that with the houses help protect the occupants inside, we've had so much wind-driven rain from this very severe event that even our modern construction, maybe plasterboards have dropped down, our carpets are going to be pulled out. So we've got a lot of resilience issues that we've got to try to incorporate into maybe new standards or new ways of doing, like flood mitigation type things. But again, it's got to be a balance of how much cost we put on the community.
Mark Gibbs from ACON, how can essential infrastructure be made more resilient, and how can nature itself play a role in doing that without going too far? As the Premier has suggested, perhaps it is going too far, deciding that you can't build anywhere at all near the water. How do you balance those decisions?
Yeah, so that's a difficult one, but I think one of the things that we always fall into is sort of falling back to the old ways, particularly hard engineering ways of doing things. One thing I will say is that when you have a situation like this, you actually have a really unique opportunity to make change. And one thing I've been listening to and hearing a lot which is obviously common sense. We have disaster, we have to look after the community, we have these immediate things, and a lot of these things, other things, we'll say we'll do it later, we'll go through a very considered process. It might take years for those recommendations to come out like in 2011, which is great, but there is a real opportunity to do things right then and there, and I'm a great fan of that. So after the 2011 floods in Brisbane, the first thing Brisbane City Council did, they elevated the floor level, minimum floor height, 500 mil, just like that. If you tried to do that later, very, very difficult. So first of all, there is an incredible opportunity to take action right then and there, which is a once and it's a really short window. And there's no reason why we can't have those plans in place right now. We could have a plan in place for Townsville that says if this happened, and it will one day, this is what we're going to do around building codes and standards and land use planning right then and there. There's no reason why that plan can't be developed. In terms of the working with nature, absolutely. I think there's a global move around doing this. It's not as easy as it sounds often, as the Premier just said. You know, there's trade-offs here. My personal feeling is we probably don't do that enough. With sea level rise, we need to think about those sorts of things a lot more. They're available, it's existing technology. There's no reason why we can't be doing a lot more of that.
Okay. Ross Davies from BlueScope, what are the building materials, the new generation building materials and products of the future that can better resist wind and water, offer durability, and importantly, how do you financially justify these state-of-the-art new materials? Because they do cost more, and you're going to have to be convincing those who are footing the bill to pay more, to not go for the cheapest option.
Well, really, it's not so much about new materials, although that's part of it. It's more about better design, and it really comes down to the home designs that are going to make the difference. So a lot of the materials already exist. You can already build on piers. You can already build with composite materials that will resist water and rain and build you a more resilient building. But it's really about the design process and the cost of that design process and the willingness for...
What do you mean by the design process specifically?
So what we're talking about there is, so BlueScope and Pidcock Architects designed a durable and resilient house that won an award in 2011. So it was both designed for cyclone, bushfire, heat resistance and other things. So more of these designs would help us move to a new era of housing. But I think it needs some incentive, and the incentives need to come through insurance or through finance mechanisms.
Alan Sunderland, there's all these grand plans for rebuilding Townsville, but the bottom line is that it's going to cost the taxpayer more money to rebuild a better city. Is the ABC going to be a thorn in the side of longer-term vision, or are you going to be getting stuck into the politicians for wasting taxpayers' money?
we're here to help, as ever.
But you love you love the conflict, don't you? You love...
Look, this is a really important conversation, and our approach is it's a conversation you need to have with the community, and that's where we come into it. The attention of the national media has moved on. We're 3 months later. Nobody cares anymore at a national level. There's bushfires in Adelaide, there's a war in Syria, but it matters intensely to the local community. We're here in the local community, and at this phase of the broadcast, we're focusing on reaching out 1, 2, 3 months on, talking to the community, forums, discussions, ideal venue for these issues to be thrashed out, and luckily both the Premier and the Mayor have agreed to come along to our next forum and join in the conversation.
And there is this issue that lingers, Premier, and that is it time to question the wisdom of having these heavy industrial industries in Townsville, copper, nickel, refineries and so forth? Is the government now starting to think that maybe it is no longer wise to persist with these heavy industries?
No, the government's view is clear that it needs to find better ways to mitigate against disasters, and that's in all facets, including industry. You wouldn't decry your community the opportunity for economic advancement because of a mistake in the past. These things were built at a time many, many decades ago. What you need to do is, during the rebuilding process, how can we reach an environmental standard that mitigates against a disaster of this event?
The Greens are telling you that ecotourism will make up for any loss in the loss of these heavy industries.
Well, then I know I'm on the right track.
And Mayor, how are you feeling about given the plumes that have resulted from some of the seepage out of these plants? Are you thinking it's time to question their future in the city, or is their economic contribution simply too great?
Look, the reality is they are the biggest employers outside of defence and government here in this city. For them to suddenly disappear would have a huge impact on the community. So really what we need is to try and come up with a way whereby, as the Premier said, we need to mitigate. We need to find out if there's a better way that they can operate without causing a risk to the environment during these wet weather events.
Greg Johnson from Stockland, you've got some large infrastructure here, shopping centres and so on that you're in charge of, and you're the sustainability guy. Your job is to make sure that these facilities can better withstand these types of events. What's your sense of what the master planned communities of the future will look like, and how also we can adapt those older shopping centres to make them more sustainable into the future?
I think looking at what the master plan community question looks like is, I guess we look at Townsville as being an area that's exposed to natural disasters like cyclones, but we understand it's climate change is also an incremental thing. So we're looking at how built form can respond in those incremental changes. So we look at the indoor environment quality and how we can respond to increased heat events as well as storm and cyclone events. So it's about design, as Ross said. In shopping centres, for example, there's not a lot we can do about the design of an existing building, but we can look at ways to make it more resilient. So we can look at the structural integrity of the roofing systems, we can look at the drainage systems and make sure they're maintained. We can make sure we've got our emergency response plans in place. And importantly, it's understanding what our role in the community is in communicating those messages from government around being ready. So that whole Get Ready Queensland program, that's really important for Stockland to communicate that into the community.
But you work on the sustainability side of things. The partners of Stockland, if they've got their calculators out, they're looking at you saying, gee, this is going to cost a lot more money. These shopping centres are going to cost a lot more to build and to protect. How do you convince them? How do you put forward the business case that it's worth doing?
It's about being able to continue to trade, and that's important for Stockland as a business, but it's important for our retailers as well. So the idea of being able to get back to a situation of normality as quickly as possible and recommence trading as quickly as possible is really important for us. And I guess there's a conversation to be had with our insurers in the future around where we've improved the resilience of our shopping centres and our portfolio broadly, and that may have some benefits to us in terms of insurance premium.
Is that right, Tony Coleman? Can insurance help, in fact, to encourage and reward better, sustainable, more resilient design, building materials and so on?
The short answer is yes. Resilience is the key concept here, and if resilience in the built environment leads to fewer claims, then premiums will move down if resilience is good. The insurance industry has an interesting history in some of this area. Simple example, if you install a burglar alarm, you'll often get a cheaper insurance premium from your insurer simply because you've taken risk mitigating measures. Similarly, there are examples post some of the bushfire events in Australia where, because properties have been rebuilt in a much more fire resistant way, they get cheaper premiums. So because it's a competitive market, the best risks will always command a lower premium. So I think there's quite a bit of scope in that area. At the end of the day, though, the balance between the insurance cost and the extra cost, if there is an extra cost of building the capital infrastructure, will obviously be a trade-off, but there's definitely scope to explore.
Glenn Fisher, the ADF remains an important part of Townsville and therefore plays an important part in the dialogue about the way forward. What's the longer term future for the Defence Forces in Townsville, and what have you learnt from the disaster that helps you plan for the future?
Well, Paul, I think what Mayor Hill put out before, it's an opportunity. There's mutual benefits in investing into the community. Defence is one of those organisations that it doesn't sit on its own. It needs to have that support of the community. It needs to be involved with the community. Any disasters such as the ones we've had in the past, there's always been that working relationship between the local government, disaster, key state and federal government elements that plan for these type of organisations and help Defence maintain its role within that community. Anything that occurs in especially a town like Townsville, it's got to be taken that they're both working hand in hand. Defence uses the port, so when something's looked at improving the port itself, it's got to be looked at from both sides. How is the Defence involvement and requirements, how does that meet the Mayor's basic understanding of, well, the community's also got to get a benefit out of it as well. So we've got to make sure we've got that balance here right. For the long term, Defence is going to be one of those organisations that's in support of a local disaster, a local government, but also in the rebuilding of it, again, it's in support of that element.
And this is the point where I say Townsville does rebuild better. The city is taking into account all of your advice, rebuilds a more resilient city so that the next time, heaven forbid, another one of these events sweeps through, we are better prepared and no one dies as a result of it. Please thank our panellists for this terrific hypothetical discussion today. I have managed